In 1976, Jamaica's government agreed to a loan from the International Monetary Fund that came with conditions attached: cut public spending, devalue the currency, remove food subsidies, and open the economy to foreign competition. Within a few years, average Jamaicans were paying more for basic staples like flour and cornmeal, government job cuts had pushed unemployment higher, and the economy that was supposed to be rescued was, by several measures, worse off than before the loan arrived. And yet Jamaica kept coming back. Between the 1970s and the 2010s, the country entered more than a dozen separate IMF programs, each one promising the same thing: short-term pain in exchange for long-term stability that, for decades, never quite seemed to arrive. Jamaica is not an unusual case. It is close to the median outcome for a strikingly large number of countries that have gone through IMF programs since the institution was created after World War II. Which raises an uncomfortable question this video is going to sit with directly. Is the International Monetary Fund, as its most committed critics argue, an institution that systematically keeps developing nations poor, trapping them in cycles of debt and austerity that primarily benefit wealthy creditor nations and Western financial interests? Or is it something messier, an imperfect institution doing a genuinely difficult job, lending money to countries already in crisis, under conditions that are painful precisely because the underlying problems were serious to begin with? Problems the IMF didn't create and can't simply wish away with more generous terms? To understand this, you first need to understand what the IMF actually is and why it exists. Founded in 1944 alongside the World Bank as part of the Bretton Woods Agreement, the same conference that established the dollar as the global reserve currency, the IMF's original purpose was to help countries manage short-term balance of payments crises, moments when a nation cannot pay for its imports or service its foreign debt because it has run out of foreign currency reserves. The theory was straightforward: provide temporary bridge financing so a country doesn't have to default or collapse into economic chaos, while the country implements reforms to fix whatever caused the crisis in the first place. That second part, the reforms, is where nearly all of the controversy lives. IMF loans come attached to conditions, commonly called conditionality, which typically require borrowing governments to cut public spending, raise interest rates, devalue their currency, privatize state-owned industries, and remove subsidies on things like food and fuel. These conditions are collectively known as structural adjustment, and starting heavily in the 1980s and continuing through the 1990s, they became the default price of admission for dozens of developing nations seeking IMF assistance during a wave of debt crises that swept across Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia. Why does the IMF insist on these specific conditions rather than simply handing over money? The institution's own justification is that lending without reform just delays a bigger crisis. If a government is spending far more than it collects in revenue, printing money to cover the gap, and subsidizing goods at prices the economy can't sustain, providing a loan without addressing those root causes means the country will likely be back in crisis within a few years, this time with even more debt. From this perspective, conditionality isn't punishment. It's an attempt to ensure the loan actually solves the problem instead of just postponing it. Critics see something different happening in practice. The most influential critique came from economists like Joseph Stiglitz, a former chief economist of the World Bank, who became one of the IMF's most prominent critics after witnessing structural adjustment programs firsthand during the Asian financial crisis of 1997. Stiglitz and others argued that IMF conditions were frequently applied with a one-size-fits-all rigidity, imposing the same package of spending cuts and austerity regardless of a country's specific circumstances, and that the immediate human cost, in the form of job losses, reduced healthcare and education spending and currency devaluations that made imported food and medicine more expensive, often fell hardest on the poorest citizens who had no role whatsoever in creating the crisis their government was borrowing to fix. The evidence on actual outcomes is genuinely mixed, and this is worth sitting with rather than glossing over. Some countries that went through IMF programs did eventually stabilize and grow. South Korea, hit hard during the 1997 Asian financial crisis, implemented IMF-backed reforms and emerged within a few years as a stronger, more resilient economy. Though Korean officials and economists have long debated how much credit belongs to the IMF program itself versus Korea's own institutional strengths and export-driven recovery that likely would have occurred to some degree regardless. Other countries fared far worse. Argentina entered IMF programs repeatedly across the 1990s and 2000s, following austerity prescriptions closely, only to collapse into one of the most severe economic crises in its modern history in 2001. A default and currency collapse that many Argentine economists directly blame on IMF-encouraged policies that kept the peso artificially pegged to the dollar long after that peg had become unsustainable. This is where a structural criticism becomes harder to dismiss than complaints about any single country's outcome, who actually controls the IMF's decisions. Voting power at the IMF is allocated primarily based on financial contributions to the institution, a system called quota shares, which means wealthy countries, and the United States in particular, hold outsized influence over the institution's policies and leadership. The United States alone holds enough voting share to exercise an effective veto over major IMF decisions, since the institution's rules require an 85% supermajority for its most significant governance changes, and the U.S. quota share has consistently sat just above the 15% threshold needed to single-handedly block such changes. By long-standing informal agreement dating back to Bretton Woods, the IMF's managing director has always been European, while the World Bank's president has always been American, an arrangement that has drawn persistent criticism from developing nations who argue the two most powerful international financial institutions have never been led by anyone from the regions most affected by their lending decisions. Reform efforts to rebalance quota shares toward emerging economies like China, India, and Brazil, whose share of the global economy has grown substantially since the IMF's founding, have moved forward only slowly and incrementally over the decades, a pace critics attribute to wealthy incumbent members having little incentive to voluntarily dilute their own influence. Why does this governance structure matter beyond simple fairness? Because it shapes whose economic theories get applied and whose interests get prioritized when conditions are negotiated. Critics point to what became known as the Washington Consensus, a set of market liberalization policies, deregulation, privatization, trade openness that dominated IMF and World Bank thinking throughout the 1980s and 1990s, and that closely mirrored the economic preferences of the wealthy Western nations that dominate the institution's governance, regardless of whether those specific policies were the best fit for every borrowing country's unique circumstances. A more recent, and for many Western viewers more familiar, example unfolded in Greece starting in 2010. Facing a sovereign debt crisis after years of hidden deficit spending came to light, Greece received the largest bailout program in IMF history at the time, jointly financed alongside the European Central Bank and European Commission in what became known as the Troika arrangement. The conditions were severe even by historical IMF standards. Pension cuts exceeding 40% for some retirees, minimum wage reductions, mass public sector layoffs, and tax increases implemented during what was already a deep recession. Greece's economy contracted by roughly a quarter over the following years. A collapse in output comparable in scale to the United States during the Great Depression, and unemployment peaked above 25%, with youth unemployment exceeding 50% at its worst point. The IMF's own internal evaluation office later published an unusually candid assessment acknowledging that the fund had significantly underestimated how severely austerity would shrink the Greek economy. A technical error economists call misjudging the fiscal multiplier, essentially failing to anticipate that cutting government spending during a deep recession would shrink the economy by substantially more than standard models predicted, making the debt burden as a share of a now much smaller economy even harder to manage than before the program began. Some IMF staff economists reportedly pushed internally for debt relief for Greece far earlier than European creditors, particularly Germany, were willing to accept, revealing a genuine internal tension within the institution itself between staff economists focused on debt sustainability and the political preferences of the powerful member governments providing the bailout funds. Greece's experience is frequently cited by critics as the clearest modern evidence that IMF-style austerity can meaningfully worsen a crisis it was meant to solve, while defenders note that Greece did eventually stabilize and return to primary budget surpluses, arguing the pain, however severe, ultimately proved necessary. Consider a second, less internationally visible case that illustrates how this same pattern plays out far from Western headlines. Sub-Saharan Africa throughout the 1980s and 1990s. Dozens of African nations underwent IMF-backed structural adjustment programs, often as a condition for both IMF lending and, separately, continued access to World Bank development financing and debt relief from wealthy creditor nations. A substantial body of economic research published in subsequent decades found that many of these programs coincided with, and in several documented cases directly contributed to, reduced public health spending precisely as the HIV/AIDS epidemic was accelerating across the region, weakened agricultural sectors after subsidies were removed too quickly for domestic farmers to adjust, and, in some countries, actual declines in per capita income over the adjustment period. Outcomes that fueled a specific and lasting grievance, that the IMF had prioritized fiscal discipline and creditor repayment over the immediate survival needs of the people living through the crisis. The scale of frustration these outcomes generated eventually produced one of the largest global activism campaigns of the late 20th century. Jubilee 2000, a coalition of religious groups, charities, and grassroots organizers spanning dozens of countries, campaigned throughout the 1990s for outright debt cancellation for the poorest nations, arguing that decades of interest payments on original loans had already been repaid many times over, while the underlying principle remained crushing and, in many cases, had originally financed corrupt or wasteful projects that ordinary citizens never benefited from in the first place. The campaign achieved a genuine, measurable victory. The Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, launched jointly by the IMF and World Bank in 1996 and expanded in 1999, eventually canceled tens of billions of dollars in debt across roughly 36 countries, predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa. Studies of the initiative's aftermath generally found meaningful increases in health and education spending in participating countries once debt payments stopped consuming such a large share of government budgets, evidence frequently cited by critics as proof that debt relief, not further austerity, was what many of these economies actually needed all along. The IMF itself has, notably, revised some of its own thinking since that era, in ways worth acknowledging rather than ignoring. Following extensive internal and external criticism, the institution's own research department published papers throughout the 2000s, more openly acknowledging that certain historical austerity prescriptions had underestimated their negative impact on growth. And the IMF has since incorporated more flexibility around protecting social spending, health and education budgets specifically, within newer loan programs. Whether this represents genuine institutional learning or a public relations adjustment in response to decades of sustained criticism is itself a matter of ongoing debate among the economists who study the institution closely. And reasonable people who have studied the record extensively land on different sides of that particular question. So, who actually benefits from the current arrangement and who bears the cost? Wealthy creditor nations benefit from a system that generally ensures debts get repaid rather than written off, protecting the value of loans held by their own banks and bondholders, and gain outsized influence over the economic policies of dozens of borrowing nations through their dominant voting share. The IMF itself, as an institution, benefits from a continued role as the lender of last resort that countries have few alternatives to when a genuine balance of payments crisis hits and private capital markets have already fled. A position that gives it leverage no ordinary commercial lender could ever obtain, since a country facing default genuinely has nowhere else comparable to turn. Borrowing nations gain access to financing during moments of genuine crisis when no one else will lend, avoiding the kind of chaotic, uncontrolled default that can be even more economically devastating than austerity. Though that financing typically arrives with conditions the borrowing government did not fully choose, and in many documented cases did not fully believe were correct for its specific situation, even while accepting them out of necessity. The costs, when programs go wrong, land overwhelmingly on citizens with no direct say in how their government negotiated the loan. Workers who lose public sector jobs, families facing higher food and fuel prices after subsidies are removed, patients facing reduced healthcare access after budget cuts, none of whom voted for the specific terms attached to financing their government accepted, often as the only alternative to an even more chaotic default. This is, in the end, another version of the efficiency versus resilience trade-off explored elsewhere on this channel, though inverted from most of our previous examples, where systems like container shipping or rare earth refining became fragile by optimizing too heavily for low-cost efficiency. The IMF's structural adjustment model optimized heavily for fiscal discipline and creditor confidence, sometimes at the direct expense of the social resilience, functioning healthcare systems, stable employment, protected vulnerable populations that countries actually needed to weather a crisis without lasting damage to an entire generation's economic prospects. Which brings the story back to Jamaica and the dozen-plus IMF programs it moved through across 4 decades. Jamaica's most recent program, agreed in 2013 and followed by additional arrangements through the 2020s, looked notably different from the ones that came before it. More emphasis on protecting social spending, more flexibility in the pace of fiscal adjustment, outcomes that Jamaican officials and IMF staff alike have pointed to as evidence the institution has genuinely evolved, with the country's debt-to-GDP ratio falling substantially and growth returning without the same depth of social disruption that characterized earlier programs in the 1980s and 1990s. Whether that evolution reflects a fundamental rethinking of how the world's most powerful lender should treat its most vulnerable borrowers, or simply a more careful, better managed version of the same underlying power imbalance that has defined the relationship since 1944, remains, like so much about this institution, a question reasonable people studying the same evidence continue to answer very differently.